The call came from the heart of Malaysia, a remote village nestled at the edge of a dense mangrove swamp. Detective Elric Graves sat in his dimly lit office in Kuala Lumpur, reviewing the grim report. 10 men, all from the same village of Kampong Bayong, had been found dead over the course of a month. The victims shared a horrifying fate. Their bodies were pale, their eyes wide open in terror, and their necks bore deep puncture wounds. There was no blood at the scenes, as if it had been drained completely. Locals whispered of a supernatural culprit, the Pontianak, a vengeful female spirit said to prey on men, her presence marked by the smell of frangipani flowers and the eerie cry of a baby. Graves, accustomed to blending myth with logic, packed his iron dagger and left for Kampong Bayong. The sun was setting as he reached the village, casting the swamp in an ominous red glow. The detective adjusted his hat, stepping off the boat onto the creaky wooden jetty. The village headman, Pak Zul, greeted him with a grave expression. "Detective Graves," Pak Zul said, his voice heavy. "Thank you for coming. But you must understand, this isn't a crime a man can solve with reason alone." Graves met his gaze. "Let's find out, shall we?" Kampong Bayong was a quiet, tight-knit community. Graves walked its narrow paths, noting the palpable fear in the villagers' eyes. Doors and windows were shuttered tightly, and offerings of food and incense lined the swamp's edge. Pak Zul led Graves to the home of the most recent victim, a fisherman named Hamid. His widow, Fatima, sat weeping on the floor, clutching a small charm made of red string and beads. He heard the cries, Fatima said between sobs. "A baby, wailing in the swamp." He went to look, and he didn't come back. Graves knelt beside her, his voice calm. "Did you notice anything strange before he left? A smell, perhaps?" Fatima hesitated. "The flowers. Frangipani. It was so strong that night." Graves exchanged a glance with Pak Zul. "It fits the legend," he said. The headman nodded grimly. "But legend or not, men are dying. What will you do, detective?" Graves stood, his expression steely. "Find her." That evening, Graves visited the swamp's edge where Hamid's body had been found. The water shimmered under the moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. He crouched by the muddy bank, his sharp eyes scanning for anything unusual. The reeds were trampled, and the mud bore faint impressions of bare feet, small, delicate prints that seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanished just as abruptly. Nearby, he found a single frangipani flower, its petals pristine despite the muck. He picked it up, holding it to his nose. The scent was intoxicating yet oddly repellent. "That's her calling card," Pak Zul said, standing a few feet away. Graves pocketed the flower. "She's toying with us, leaving traces where she's struck. She wants to be feared." Pak Zul frowned. "Do you think it's truly her? The Pontianak?" Graves didn't answer immediately. He stared into the dark waters of the swamp, their surface rippling as if something moved beneath. "Let's see what the night brings." Graves set up a small camp near the swamp that night, determined to stay close to the scene. Pak Zul offered to join him, but Graves insisted on going alone. The hours dragged on in silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of insects. Just as the moon reached its zenith, a sound pierced the stillness, a baby's cry, faint and mournful, drifting from deep within the swamp. Graves stood, his hand instinctively going to the iron dagger at his side. He moved cautiously toward the sound, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dense foliage. The cry grew louder, more desperate, until it seemed to surround him. Then, it stopped abruptly. The air grew cold, and the smell of frangipani enveloped him like a shroud. Graves turned sharply, his flashlight illuminating a figure in white, a woman with long, flowing hair standing at the water's edge. Her back was to him, but her presence was suffocating, exuding an unnatural stillness. "Pontianak," he said under his breath. The figure turned slowly, revealing a pale face and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. She opened her mouth, and the cry of a baby erupted from her lips, louder and more horrifying than before. Graves' instincts kicked in. He drew the iron dagger from his coat, the blade glinting in the moonlight. The Pontianak hissed, her face twisting in rage, and with inhuman speed, she lunged toward him. He slashed at her, the iron slicing through her ghostly form. She shrieked, the sound reverberating through the swamp, and dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The smell of frangipani lingered in her absence. Graves stumbled back, his breath ragged. He scanned the area, but she was gone. The swamp fell silent again, the oppressive cold lifting. Graves sheathed his dagger and walked back to his camp, his mind racing. He had faced spirits before, but this was different. The Pontianak wasn't just a restless soul, she was a predator, calculating and relentless. The next morning, Graves returned to the village to report what he had seen. The villagers listened in stunned silence as he described the Pontianak's appearance and the attack. "She's real," Pak Zul said, his voice trembling. "All these years, we thought she was just a story to scare children." "She's more than real," Graves said. "She's powerful, and she won't stop until she's forced to." "How do we stop her?" one villager asked, desperation in his voice. Graves glanced at the crowd. "Legends say she's bound to her sorrow, grief and rage anchor her to this world. If we can find what ties her here, we might be able to banish her." Pak Zul nodded. "Then we'll help you find it. Whatever it takes." Detective Elric Graves spent the morning questioning the elders of Kampung Bayong, hoping to uncover the origin of the Pontianak haunting the swamp. Stories spilled out, fragmented and tinged with fear, but one tale stood out above the rest. "It was decades ago," Pak Zul explained, his voice low. "A young woman named Siti lived near the edge of the swamp. She was beautiful, kind, but unlucky. Her husband abandoned her while she was pregnant, and she was left alone to give birth." Graves leaned forward. "What happened to her?" Pak Zul hesitated. "No one knows exactly. Some say she died in childbirth, her cries unanswered. Others say she was murdered, her body buried beneath a frangipani tree. But they all agree on one thing, her sorrow turned into rage, and she became the Pontianak." Graves absorbed the story. "Where was she buried?" Pak Zul frowned. "The tree is gone, but its place is deep in the swamp, near the mangroves. Few dare to go there." Graves stood, his iron dagger glinting at his side. "Then it's time to visit her grave." Graves set out with Pak Zul and a small group of villagers willing to guide him. They waded through murky water and tangled roots, the swamp's oppressive heat and buzzing insects adding to the tension. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the scent of frangipani thickened. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers barely audible over the sound of splashing water. "There," Pak Zul said, pointing ahead. A lone tree stump rose from the water, its surface blackened and scarred. Around it, the swamp seemed lifeless, the water still and dark. Graves approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. At the base of the stump, he found fragments of bone and a tattered cloth buried beneath a thin layer of mud. "This is it," he said. "Her resting place." The air grew colder still, and a faint wailing echoed through the mangroves. The villagers froze, clutching their charms and murmuring prayers. "She knows we're here," Pak Zul whispered. As the wailing intensified, Graves unearthed a small, weathered box buried beneath the stump. Inside, he found a lock of black hair tied with a red ribbon and a piece of parchment covered in faded writing. He handed the box to Pak Zul. "This must be connected to her, something she cherished or something tied to her grief." Before Pak Zul could respond, the wailing stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Then, from the shadows of the mangroves, the Pontianak emerged. Her form was more terrifying than before, her long hair writhed like living tendrils, her hollow eyes burning with malice. She hovered above the water, her tattered white dress billowing as if caught in an unseen wind. "You dare disturb my grave," she hissed, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. Graves stepped forward, holding the iron dagger at the ready. "It's time to end this." The Pontianak lunged at Graves with inhuman speed, her claws slashing through the air. He dodged, his dagger slicing through her form. She screamed, a sound that rattled the mangroves, and dissolved into smoke before reforming behind him. Pak Sul and the villagers scattered, their courage faltering. Graves stood his ground, his iron dagger cutting through the Pontianak's relentless attacks. "Why do you linger here?" Graves demanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. "What keeps you bound?" The Pontianak's form flickered, her rage momentarily giving way to sorrow. "They left me," she wailed. "He left me. Alone, betrayed." Her voice cracked, and she lunged again, but this time Graves was ready. He raised the box he had found, holding it like a shield. The Pontianak recoiled, her eyes widening in terror. "No," she shrieked. "Not that." Graves tightened his grip. "This is the key, isn't it? This is what ties you here." After the Pontianak retreated, Graves and Pak Sul returned to the village, the box clutched tightly in Graves' hands. The air in Kampung Bayong felt heavier, as if the swamp's curse had followed them. In the safety of Pak Sul's home, Graves examined the parchment from the box. The writing was faint, but he could make out a single name, Hassan. "Who is Hassan?" Graves asked. Pak Sul's face darkened. "He was her husband, the one who abandoned her. He fled the village after she died, leaving her alone to rot in that swamp." Graves nodded, piecing together the story. "Her rage isn't just about her death. It's about betrayal, being abandoned, forgotten." Pak Sul frowned. "If this box is what ties her here, can it be destroyed?" Graves shook his head. "It's not that simple. Destroying it might unleash her anger completely. We need to help her move on, release her from her sorrow." Graves spent the next day preparing a ritual to release the Pontianak. Drawing on his knowledge of folklore, he planned to return the items in the box to her grave and perform a cleansing ceremony. The villagers gathered nervously as he explained his plan. "We'll need to return to the mangroves," Graves said. "It's dangerous, but it's the only way." Pak Sul and a few others volunteered to join him, their fear outweighed by their determination to end the nightmare. As they ventured into the swamp once more, the scent of frangipani grew stronger, and the wailing resumed, louder and more anguished than before. Graves held the box tightly, his voice steady as he led the way. "Stay close. This ends tonight." At the mangrove grove, Graves placed the box at the base of the tree stump. The air grew thick with tension as the wailing intensified, and the Pontianak appeared once more. "You cannot free me," she screamed, her voice a mix of rage and despair. "I will never leave." Graves stepped forward, holding the lock of hair aloft. "You don't have to stay," he said firmly. "Your pain has kept you here, but it doesn't have to. Let it go." The Pontianak hesitated, her form flickering. "They forgot me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He forgot me." Graves knelt by the stump, lighting incense and muttering words of release. The smoke curled around the Pontianak, softening her edges. Her rage gave way to sorrow, and she let out one final, mournful cry. Then, with a whisper of gratitude, she dissolved into the night. The mangrove swamp was silent for the first time in months. The oppressive cold that had gripped the area lifted, and the eerie scent of frangipani faded into the night. Detective Elric Graves stood at the base of the charred tree stump, the box of the Pontianak's relics now buried beneath it. The incense he had burned still lingered faintly in the humid air. Pak Sul and the villagers stood behind him, their faces a mix of awe and relief. "She's gone," Pak Sul murmured, his voice breaking the silence. Graves nodded, his exhaustion hidden behind his stoic demeanor. Her spirit's been released, but it wasn't easy. Her sorrow was her anchor, and it's been weighing on this place for decades. One of the villagers, a young man named Ismail, approached cautiously. Will she come back? Graves turned to face him. Not if the swamp is respected. Her story was one of betrayal and abandonment. Let her memory serve as a warning to honor the living and the dead. Over the following days, Kampung Bayong began to heal. The villagers, once paralyzed by fear, slowly returned to their routines. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered over the swamp dissipated, replaced by an almost serene stillness. Graves worked with Pak Zul to establish a shrine near the edge of the mangrove. Built from simple wood and adorned with frangipani flowers, the shrine served as both an offering and a memorial for the Pontianak. We should never forget her, Graves said as he placed a small candle at the shrine's base. Forgetting her is what bound her here in the first place. The villagers nodded in agreement, their fear replaced by a solemn respect for the spirit that had haunted them. Though the Pontianak had been released, Graves couldn't shake the feeling that her story held more layers than he had uncovered. On his last day in the village, he returned to Pak Zul's home to review the parchment he had found in the box. The writing was faint and fragmented, but one passage caught his eye. It wasn't just a lament for betrayal, it hinted at another child, a boy born to the Pontianak before her death. Pak Zul, Graves said, showing him the parchment. Was there any record of her child surviving? Pak Zul frowned, his face clouded with thought. There were rumors, long ago, that the boy was taken by distant relatives. No one knows what happened to him. Graves considered this. If he's alive, her sorrow might have lingered in part because of her separation from him. Her spirit could only rest if that connection was acknowledged. Pak Zul nodded slowly. Perhaps one day, he'll return to this place, even if only to pay respects. As Graves prepared to leave Kampung Bayong, the villagers gathered to see him off. They presented him with a woven charm made of frangipani flowers and red string, a symbol of gratitude and protection. Pak Zul shook his hand firmly. You've saved us, Detective Graves. The swamp feels like it belongs to us again. Graves nodded, slipping the charm into his coat pocket. It's your home. Take care of it, and remember what happened here. With that, he boarded the small boat that would carry him back to the mainland. As the village faded into the distance, he glanced back one last time. The shrine stood out against the darkened trees, a quiet testament to the Pontianak's tragic story. Weeks later, in the bustling city of Kuala Lumpur, Graves couldn't escape the lingering presence of the Pontianak. Late one night, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment reviewing notes from old cases, the faint scent of frangipani wafted through the room. He froze, his pen hovering over the paper. The scent grew stronger, mingling with the faint hum of the city outside. Then he heard it, a soft, mournful cry, like the echo of a baby's wail. Graves stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the iron dagger he kept on his desk. But the sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only silence. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Even in death, you're not far, are you? A week after the strange encounter in his apartment, Graves received a letter from a researcher based in Johor, near the southern tip of Malaysia. The letter described a recent string of mysterious deaths in a nearby swamp, bearing uncanny similarities to the killings in Kampung Bayong. The letter ended with a chilling line. The villagers say the scent of frangipani fills the air before the deaths. Graves set the letter down, his mind racing. Had the Pontianak truly been released, or had her curse spread to another place? He pocketed the frangipani charm the villagers had given him and prepared for another journey. If the Pontianak sorrow had left Kampung Bayong but found a new home, his work was far from over. Detective Elric Graves arrived in the southern town of Tanjung Piai, near the mangrove swamps that bordered Johor and the sea. The village here was larger than Kampung Bayong, but the atmosphere was the same, uneasy and fearful. The researcher who had written to him, Dr. Nur Aina, greeted him at the local community center. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, though her expression softened as she shook Graves' hand. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Aina said. "I wasn't sure anyone would take my letter seriously." Graves adjusted his hat. "The Pontianak isn't a story I can ignore. Tell me what's been happening here." Dr. Aina led him to a map of the area, pointing to a series of red dots along the swamp's edge. 7 men have died in the past 2 weeks. All of them were fishermen or loggers working near the mangroves. Their bodies were found pale, with puncture wounds on their necks, and not a drop of blood left in them. Graves frowned. The same signs. Was there anything unusual reported before the deaths? Dr. Aina hesitated. The villagers have been hearing cries at night, like a baby wailing, and they've smelled frangipani flowers. They're convinced it's her. Graves nodded grimly. If she's here, we need to act fast. The more she kills, the stronger she becomes. That evening, Graves walked along the edge of the swamp, his boots sinking into the soft, muddy ground. The setting sun cast long shadows across the mangroves, their twisted roots creating eerie shapes in the fading light. Dr. Aina followed him, a flashlight in hand. "Do you really think it's the same Pontianak?" she asked. "It's hard to say," Graves replied. "Spirits like her are tied to the land and its history. It's possible this is another manifestation of the same sorrow, or the remnants of the one I faced before." As they approached the spot where the most recent victim had been found, the air grew colder. A faint, sweet scent filled Graves' nostrils, frangipani. "She's close," he said, gripping his iron dagger. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, and the faint cry of a baby echoed through the mangroves. Dr. Aina froze, her face pale. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the sound they've been hearing." Graves stepped forward, his voice steady. "Stay close. And don't run, no matter what happens." The cry grew louder, more mournful, as if it were coming from every direction at once. The frangipani scent intensified, clinging to the air like a suffocating mist. Then she appeared.